for the integration process, this is what I focus my dissertation on. So a dissertation, if you guys don't know, is it's a research assignment where you have to find people, you have to kind of create a inclusion criteria of a specific topic that you're going to write about. So for example, my field that I chose to write on was how to integrate spiritual awakening. So I had to find people that were people that had had a spiritual awakening, first of all. I had to choose people that I didn't have to, this is the inclusion criteria I chose, was people that had had a spiritual awakening, that were mentally stable, that had been practicing a specific method for over 5 years. So they had to have stuck with a single method, whatever that method was, because and the method that I chose is a really interesting method that you guys can always reach out to me about. It's a method that I follow, but it's a method called path work. It's a psycho-spiritual approach, and it became really important to choose this because you really have to niche it down. Because if I had to say, how do you integrate a spiritual awakening, and it's just so broad, there's too much information coming in. So I had to narrow it down. So it's like how to integrate a spiritual awakening, because a spiritual awakening is too broad. So then I was like, okay, how to integrate a spiritual awakening. And then my teachers and stuff like, no, it needs to be even more narrow. And then I was like, how to integrate a spiritual awakening through the pathwork method. And I had to find people that have been working with the pathwork method for over 5 years, that had a spiritual awakening and were mentally stable. So you can imagine trying to find these people takes quite a long time. And then once you find them, you have to do questionnaires and interviews and all these different prompts to kind of extract information. Once you get the information, you have to create a certain code book. And then with the code book, I think I ended up having like 500 codes, and you have to sync them all up into 5 main themes. And the 5 main themes are the ones that are presented in front of you. And to go through them, this is the interesting about these main themes, is that every single person that I interviewed went through every single one of these five. So if you're interested in this lecture, if you're interested in spirituality and spiritual transformation, spiritual growth, and spiritual awakening, then these seem to be the 5 stages that you're going to go through. And spiritual awakening doesn't necessarily mean one thing. What I also found is there's multiple awakenings. It's not just one awakening. So these experiences keep happening over and over again in these different cycles. There's different cycles of it. So the first theme, which was really interesting, was the spiritual awakening and initiation. And that was, you know, every single person that was interviewed experienced some form of initiation. And what I mean by that is every single one of them reached a certain level of crisis. So it seems to me that the catalyst for a spiritual awakening all comes from crisis, whether it's, a breakup, financial struggles, the loss of a loved one through death. These are usually catalysts that make you, near-death experiences, all these different things that happen to people. There's a profound sense of crisis. And I'm not talking like just a little bit, like a little bit of a struggle. Every single one of them, like, for example, the one person, her son ended up getting leukemia, and she was going through that, So the other person was going through a divorce, and, there are all these specific life challenges that seem to take you to the deepest emotional state that you can get. And then all of a sudden, within that crisis comes this little crack of light that comes in. It's a little glimpse of there's something more to life than this level of suffering. And I know this one personally, with my one, I've shared with a couple people that I had a profound fear of death. And that's when I mentioned I had so much anxiety. I used to always, get really scared about getting sick. I used to get a cough and think that I had cancer. And it was just, being, I don't know what to call it, but it was a hypochondriac. And every single time this fear used to come. And I remember that was the anxiety. I always thought that I was getting sick, and whenever I got sick, I thought I was dying. And then eventually I created so much fear. It's so crazy when I think about it now. I had so much fear around this death experience that it just became very conscious to me. And I just constantly thought about dying and what's going to happen when I die. And then I started developing a lot of anxiety. Then when I developed the anxiety, I was in a fight or flight response and survival mode within the body. The nervous system was in shock, which means my digestion wasn't working. So then I couldn't digest dairy, I couldn't digest gluten. So I had to give up these certain foods. And then I started losing weight. And then when I started losing weight and people were telling me, you've lost so much weight, I think I lost like 7 kilos in the first 6 weeks after giving up gluten. And I remember at that point, I was like, oh shit, I'm actually dying. And I started Google doctoring and I was like, cancer, this, that. And I just freaked out. And then I remember it was this is wild. I have a clear memory sitting in my car. It was raining, and there was this homeless person sitting on the bench just in the rain. And I remember, and it was like he was an older guy, must have been about in his 60s, like didn't look in good shape. And I remember looking at him, and I wished I was him. I was like, this guy's so lucky. He's not dying, And I was like, kind of, it sounds crazy because I fully believed that I was dying. And then when I listened to this philosophical talk, that's when I had my awakening. So there was this level of crisis where it got so intense that one little clue into spirituality just opened the door for me. But as I said, the spiritual awakening opens up to everything, which moves us on to the second stage, which was you awaken to everything, not just the light. You awaken to trauma. And it's a big topic. We've all experienced it. Trauma is a very triggering word, but you could use another word which is probably more suited, which you could say you've experienced shocks in your life. Because a lot of the times we put trauma in the realm of, sexual assault and, violent abuse, but trauma is many things, like sexual assault and all those things. These are really bad things that shouldn't have happened. So trauma, you could say, is bad things that shouldn't have happened. But there's another side to trauma that people don't pay attention to, and that is things that didn't happen that should have happened, which is also traumatic. So, for example, imagine being a child and being abused by your father. That's a bad thing that shouldn't have happened. Now, imagine being a child and not being acknowledged or cared for that well by your father. That's something that didn't happen. It's not evidence, it's just missing. But that too is trauma playing out. So when you go into the spiritual awakening path, it starts to open up everything, and it starts to open up this book of the path and these belief systems that you have and these limiting belief systems that you had that were all created in childhood by either things that happened that shouldn't have happened, that creates these limiting beliefs in you, or the things that didn't happen that should have happened, where you also carry these specific beliefs that I'm not worthy, I'm not loved, I'm not cared for, no one cares about me, whatever that might be. When you have that spiritual awakening, part of that path is going into that. It's going into what pathwork would call the lower self, going into look at the trauma, going into accept it, and going into transform it. And it's really in alignment with what we spoke about earlier with the Spiritual Emergency by Stan and Christina Groff. The first one that I mentioned, the Spiritual Awakening and Initiation, there's a really good, it's actually on YouTube and it's free, called Finding Joe. And it's based on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And that's all about the spiritual awakening and initiation and the hero's call to adventure, because Joseph Campbell is the guy that wrote the quote in the beginning that I shared. But he's also a philosopher, but he studied myths and he found a common story throughout all the myths. In the same way that I found 5 themes within this specific topic, Joseph Campbell focused on myths and found 4 main themes. And he put them all together, and it's what he calls the hero's journey. And it's all about this spiritual initiation that sends every single person in this world on their own hero's journey. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. It's really good. It's called Finding Joe, and it's on YouTube. So the third phase was a very important one, practice and commitment. Every single person that I interviewed were committed to the practice of path work. It was one specific path, and they all said, and including myself, I know this from experience too, when you're jumping around from practice to practice, it's like, I'm going to do yoga, I'm going to do, Vipassana, I'm going to do, ayahuasca, I'm going to do all these different things that it's, for me, I can't really complain about it because it's in that search, I was looking for something and then I found the path work, which was my path. But so part of it, part of the path is finding your path, the practice and commitment that you can show up to daily. All of these people now have been working with one specific path, not bouncing around anymore. They found one specific path and they stuck with that one. And then they started to get into the depth because a lot of the times when we find a practice, we get to a stage where we get bored. And boredom is the doorway into the unconscious. It's like it's a way to, a lot of the times if we're sitting doing nothing, we get bored and we pull up a distraction. A lot of us fear boredom, and boredom is the first sign of moving in towards the more unconscious aspects of ourselves. So boredom is a gift, but a very challenging one. So if you can find boredom, go after it because it's a really, really, it's a big doorway into the spiritual path, I find personally. So something else that echoes practice and commitment is Ken Wilber. He's got this thing that he coined called integral life practice. So if anyone wants to look at another method, that's another method that you can look at. He talks about this spiritual path in 4 different quadrants. And he talks about there's waking up, which is the spiritual awakening. He says there's waking up, there's cleaning up, which is similar to the trauma and integration. There's showing up, which is the whole community-based thing. And there's, what was the other one? I don't know if I can remember the other one. But if it's another method, if you guys are interested into looking and searching for methods to find, it's another really good one. The 4th main theme is community and support. This one here seemed to be the most profound out of all of them. Everyone everyone spoke about everything, but this one everyone highlighted, saying you cannot do this on your own, and you have to and humility was one of the biggest parts, is you need to find someone that can mirror you. And the path work is really good with that because they have a community and they have specific practices where you're constantly being mirrored. So community and support is one of the most important parts that they all highlighted, saying they tried to do it on their own. All of them went on their own seeking mission, on their own spiritual journey, but it was only when they found their community that they really got into deeper levels, And in the beginning, I was telling you about this teacher that I met in India that asked me what brought me there. He also said something else in that lecture that stuck with me, and it reminds me of this theme. And he said, I remember someone asked him, they said, what can we do for practices on the spiritual path? And he said, you don't need to find practices because life will be your school. Life will give you the practices. And then he said, but if life is a school, then relationships is going to be the university. And what he meant by that was family, intimate relationships, friends. These are the things that really mirror you on the spiritual path. They really bring up old patterns, because I don't know about you guys, but I know for me, when I went back home after my spiritual adventures, I remember going back and I was traveling and I'd become this new person, and I went back and I just snapped back into my old ways and I started acting how I used to act. And I was watching myself, and there was this distance between me and who I was being. I was like, that's not me anymore. And you start to recognize that, you know, the challenges that come of integrating the spiritual embodiment into who you are and to show it, that's a really challenging part. And the only way you can do that is through community and support, is being surrounded by that community that supports it, so that you can feel confident and that you're not isolated and you're not alone, that you can embody that when you just move out into the world again and move back to the family, you know. I think Ram Dass also said that he's a famous spiritual teacher. He said, if you think you're enlightened, go visit your parents. You'll find out very soon that you're not. The the final theme, which is which was really beautiful, was after all of these first four themes, they said there was a certain amount of time that they devoted into, the initiation process, the trauma and integration, the practices, the commitment, the community and support. And as a byproduct of that, trust started to develop into their lives. They started to trust the process. So when they started to go through a new process or a new cycle, they trusted. They trusted it that this is for them. They started to really embody that every bit of suffering that they go through now, they know that it's for them. They know that it's some trauma or some limiting belief that's being surfaced, and they embrace it. And they all mentioned that they just had to trust their intuition, and now as a byproduct they just completely trust it all the time. So it seems like, I don't know what you'd call enlightenment or the end stage, but I remember asking one of the people, and I said, is there an end point to this? Is there an end point, or are you just constantly going through processes for the rest of your life? Because this guy was in his like 70s and he'd been practicing this since he was young, and he said, it never stops, but the the distances grow longer between processes. And that was a beautiful recognition. It's like, okay, you're not doing this to reach a certain point. It's all part of the process. And throughout the more you have so many processes that are unconsciously taking place, and then one at a time they start coming to the surface. And the less that are there, the more space you have to kind of enjoy life and to be present with life and not stuck in a trigger or a process, or because a process would just be nothing other than a system of beliefs that are coming up that are challenging where you're at.